This debate epitomizes the reason that I love to speak first affirmative, because I have the opportunity, before this negative team have the opportunity to throw muck at the wall to make one moral claim incredibly clear. Meat eating is a repugnant phenomenon, it is a spot on the earth, and if it were possible for us to radically decrease the amount of meat eating and livestock farming that is done, that would be a tremendous good for the world. And I hope that by the end of this debate, you'll be convinced. Let's start with the model. Matt predicts it. Obviously, we're doing a detailed model in this debate. We'll do this like many societies do rights like smoking and like alcohol, where people recognize that it's an ethically complicated choice in which people need complex faculties to consent into the choice to eat meat. And so we would ban people until the age of 18 from eating meat under any circumstances, at which point they would need to earn the right to eat meat by, maybe it's at their 18th birthday, slaughtering a cow or slaughtering a chicken or slaughtering a fish to earn the rights to eat meat. Secondly, they're angry with that one. We would make this gradual. So obviously we preempt the argument that they're going to make about this would lead to short-term food insecurity because so much of our ecosystems of how people rely on food are reliant on livestock farming. We would plan for this. We would, in advance, 10 years before implementing this policy, we would transition, for instance, to legume farming. We would upscale our investments and subsidies for things like meat substitutes. We would, for instance, first implement this amongst children and make them like New Zealand did, this is the generation that's going to be banned, and then we would, for instance, start doing it with adults and forcing them if they wanted to eat meat to earn the right. So that probably, and I hope, preempts an uncharitable negative argument about food security. And thirdly, and this is another attempt at modeling out an uncharitable negative argument, is we would do so in a tiered system. So if you want to eat fish, you just have to kill a fish, but killing a fish doesn't entitle you to eat chicken and beef and all the other delights of the culinary industry. For the reason, and I guess the justification for us doing these tiers is this recognizes that humans genuinely have formed different ethical frameworks around fish eating. There are people who are pescatarian because they believe it's ethically different. And we think that's fair enough, but also the environmental and health impacts of fish are pretty different to the rest of livestock farming. And I guess they could be well, you could just kill a fish now and eat meat, which mitigates, the mechanism of our case. So we don't want that. The second thing is that, obviously, if you kill any form of livestock, you can eat other livestock. So if you kill a chicken, you can eat beef. All right. Finally, we're gonna, in the process of people having to kill these animals to earn their right to eat meat, the goal would be to maximize viscerality and to minimize cruelty. And we think that's actually pretty possible to do. See, for instance, the fact that halal farming kills an animal very quickly, but involves a person with their bare hands and a knife killing that animal. And we reckon that maximizes the human lived experience of killing an animal with your own bare hands, but also minimizes the suffering inflicted on that animal. All right, let's go. We have one argument in this debate. It is that we will radically decrease the prevalence of meat eating, but there are several impacts that result from this. Why is this the case? And this is the most trivial mechanism of all time, which is that now people are raised for 18 years of their life without meat eating, and they have to earn the right to do so. I would say the enjoyment of meat, the cultural factors that affect whether people like eating meat are pretty relative. And then if people are confronted with having to kill an animal in order to earn a right they've never had previously, they probably would be inclined to not exercise that. They probably would have some inertia against that. But also, people don't like ending the lives of a creature, with some consciousness, or with that they can watch the life fall out of, they see blood come out of. I think there are many people in the world who eat meat but push aside the fact that they have a strong moral intuition. That's probably wrong. I think I am a classic example of that. I eat meat every day, but I still think it's pretty immoral, and if I were forced to kill an animal, I might have to reevaluate my choices. All right, why is this a good thing? This is the rest of my speech. The first thing is this is a massively good thing to decrease the amount of meat that people eat and shift the economy away from meat eating, because it is exceptionally cruel to kill animals. And the first reason for this, I just think, is animals are sentient. They are creatures with some moral value. And maybe you doubt the fact that animals are equally as sentient as humans or whatever. And I'll get to that in a second. But we should have some uncertainty about how much the rich lived experiences of animals really are rich, because we don't know what their lived experiences are. We don't know the level of complexity that they have. But even if you don't believe me there, and round 2 suggests you might not, you shouldn't have the conclusion that less sentient things are less deserving of moral worth. For instance, the intuition that I would guide you to guide against that intuition, if you have it, is you wouldn't say that disabled people's lives are worth living, perhaps even if their faculties or cognition render them less sentient than, for instance, a fully abled person. But also, I guess the mechanism of our case implies that most people have some issue, ethical or otherwise, with having to kill something because they think it has some moral value. People form deep relationships with pets that are less sentient than, for instance, humans, which suggests they have a moral value that is worth preserving. But obviously, they might come up with the rebuttal, well, you're still allowing people to eat meat, so maybe you don't believe in that principle as full-throatedly as you really purport to. To some extent, I think this debate ought to imply some ethical ambiguity about whether it's truly the wrong thing to do. We make 2 separate moral principle claims here. The one is, it is wrong to kill things because those things have value, and we radically reduce that. But the separate part of it is just, people are committing a separate moral wrong by desubjectifying animals, by abstracting out the act of killing an animal to something they can't see when they participate in eating meat. And people should be forced to reckon with that repugnant moral action that they are doing every day, if it is so true that they want to eat meat. And we entirely patch that immorality that is baked into the world, even if we don't entirely patch the immorality of eating meat. Secondly, we would say that this is an entirely environmentally destructive industry which would be good to transition away from. It is possibly the most land use inefficient form of industry possible, because they need to eat shit tons of grass and need to deforest to put them there. And that's a bad thing because it leads to carbon dioxide sinks being eroded, oxygen that we breathe being eroded. That leads to a less safe place to live. It leads to methane farts, which contribute to climate change. They put shit in water supplies, which make them less safe to drink. They lead to algal blooms that kill biodiversity. They are hugely water inefficient, which leads to water insecurity in many communities that are over-reliant on meat eating, all of which is bad. But finally, and this is the argument that I have the most interest in, they have huge negative health impacts on humans' lives. They are a huge cause of pandemics and zoonotic transformations. See, for instance, the fact that COVID, SARS, MERS, avian flu all arise from close relationships that humans have between livestock, which carry diseases that eventually can spread and become entirely novel diseases that lead to death, that lead to lots of human suffering, but also they lead to antibiotic resistance because you feed a bunch of animals antibiotics in order so that they don't get sick. But you mean those things, get eroded in their effectiveness eventually with regard to humans. But also, they are just bad to eat for human health, right? Like, they are rich in polyunsaturated trans fats, which means that they raise people's cholesterol. That cholesterol ultimately becomes LDL cholesterol, which leads to atheromatous plaque formation, which erodes coronary artery lumen size, which leads to people having heart attacks, leads to coronary artery disease. It is why coronary artery disease is most prevalent in the West, where people eat meat the most. It leads to humans' lives getting shortened. It leads to metabolic diseases. That's awful. Proud children.
Thank you, first affirmative. I welcome first negative. Here, here.
Maybe for the snowflakes in the Western world, this seems like a really crazy action, but my dad grew up on his farm killing chickens, and this was normal. This is something everyone did back in the day. You had to do it to survive. You had to kill animals. And yes, people in the Western developed world would probably have some kind of shock in adjusting to it, but they'll do it and it would be a bit unpleasant, but then once they've done it, they'll not care anymore. This would give them moral license to eat more meat, and this would just cause a lot of unpleasantness and suffering for everyone around in a way that is unconscionable. So, a few things to clarify before I get into my case. Firstly, I do not think they have the fiat to ban eating meat until the age of 18. This is for several reasons. First is, obviously, a lot of people would be very against this. This is very, beyond just a right. This is totally banning someone from a normal action that happens now. But also, this would be quite unenforceable for the reason that there are a lot of economies where meat eating is entirely unavoidable. For example, if you live in a northern wintry climate where crop harvest is unviable, there's a lot of people with religious and cultural objections that would eat this meat despite the law. And also, it would be impossible to enforce in a domestic context because parents who now have the right and the license to eat meat, in the same way that they feed their kids alcohol, they'll just give their kids the meat. And maybe you can enforce it on the adults, because if an adult walked into like a butcher, they'd have to show their ID, and the ID would say, oh, I have the right to eat meat. But you could not enforce this in a home where parents feel like their kids should be able to eat meat, maybe just for their health and development, maybe just because they think it tastes good, and they just give it to those kids. Which means either in the world where they are unable to have the fiat to do this, or it is the case where they are unable to enforce this effectively, the efficacy of their model just dies, because most of the kids that just grow up eating meat will no longer be able to actually just give up that meat at the point of eating, even if they impose that model of forcing them to kill an animal. The second part I'll just note is to the degree that they can do this, we can do it too. It's not mutually exclusive. And lastly, we can also do stuff like, just reduce a lot of cruelty, get rid of battery cage hens, regulate the industry and all that kind of stuff to make, consumption a lot more ethical, because we have the massive political capital from them taking this very controversial action. So, firstly, why does this increase consumption of meat? And then secondly, why does this suck for animals and people? Firstly, why does this increase consumption? First thing we know is that almost everyone that would eat meat right now would just opt into this, and that is for a number of reasons. The first is, I'm gonna consume the P word past Ellie gave me, but you would just look like a pussy. You didn't do, like it would just be like, bro, just kill the chicken, and you'll look like a total coward, like you chicken out if you did kill the chicken. And notably, like, this stigma would be very specific, because people who are like principally vegetarian, right, would be not touching meat and advocating for that their whole lives, versus there's a set of people who might have eaten meat and might have been like, oh, I think it's okay to eat meat, and then get to the muster and then refuse to kill the chicken, and then everyone would identify you as the one who chickened out. So I think in a lot of cultures, think like Southern American, all that kind of stuff, people would just see this as like almost like a rite of passage. Now you have to kill this chicken. The second thing to say is that meat obviously has cultural and economic coercive powers, right? Like, it's a part of a lot of key agricultural inputs in a lot of countries. People have cultural affinities with meat, and all that kind of stuff. And people see their parents eating meat when they grow up and all that kind of stuff. And also in a lot of developing countries, people don't necessarily have the choice. They don't have substantial protein substitutes. And the last thing, and the most persuasive but kind of superficial reason, is like people like eating meat, and I think that's the main reason why I keep eating meat. People just think it's tasty, and people are able to decompartmentalize the fact that something's being killed, even if they committed the murder themselves. And lastly, this causes people to lock themselves into a binary decision where in the status quo, a lot of people might have become vegetarian kind of like incrementally, or they might have been pescatarian or something, and this kind of pushes people to be like, well, either kill the animal or don't kill the animal. So, given that most people would opt in, why is it that of the people that opt in, this would substantially increase the meat eating that they do? The first thing to say is that they have moral license to eat meat now. And that is because the rhetoric of this topic is like, you have the right to eat meat. And that gives you a lot of political capital, whether it's in the judiciary, whether it's in like politics, all that kind of stuff, because this is something people, especially on the right, would defend to the death, right? They'll say this is a right that you necessarily have, and that they went through this traumatizing action, so therefore they should be able to access this benefit. Secondly, some people, or like a lot of the people, would probably feel really guilty about killing the animal. And the way that they respond, and this is the way they respond in the status quo when they're shown pictures of animals being killed often, is they'll kind of like have a sense of cognitive dissonance, and they just self-gas themselves into thinking that, oh, it's actually fine, meat is a lower life form, it's okay to kill them. They'll probably opt into the kind of moral narratives that say humans are far more important than meat. And that means they'll just would not care about eating meat at all anymore, because any moral concern they might have had before has vastly dried up. Thirdly, people just have sunk cost fallacy. Like, on your 18th, like this is what I'll do, like on my 18th birthday, if I gotta kill a crab, I just have like a crab feast a few days after, because I'll be like, well, I've gone through that unpleasant action, so I should make the most of it. In the same way that when people enter a buffet and they've already paid, they try to eat as much food as possible to make the most of it. And fourthly, people get desensitized to any generic campaigns that are happening right now, because the scale and gravity of all those campaigns is less than what you did. Like, no one's gonna scare me by showing me a picture of a chicken being tortured or a picture of a chicken being killed, because I've already done it myself, which means that all the voices of anti-animal activists and all that just completely die out and have no sailing. This is in contrast to what happens under our side, which is that a lot of people gradually become more vegetarian, you know, like they take steps into that. They don't allow that because they force a binary, where either you kill them or you're out. Also, like people care about things like cruelty and they want to regulate that, but in the world where they have no moral concern for these animals, they no longer care about cruelty. And also they're just less likely to invest in things like lab-grown meat because the imperative for that is not there when you see these animals as having no moral concern. The second argument then is why this is bad for the animal and the person. Firstly, this is like indescribably cruel because you're taking out like billions of animals around the world and then you're just killing them for the purpose of showing that someone has balls, right? Like even if you later send them to a meat factory, the primary purpose under which they are killed is as like a means to an end and not like in terms of like letting someone eat or letting someone like rejuvenate themselves, right? And I think there's something that is quite disturbing about that. But more analytically, I think people are likely to fuck up the slaughter. And that is for a number of reasons. Firstly, people just lack precision. Like a butcher is a very respectable and skillful kind of art, and it's hard. Like a lot of people will probably like try to cut the neck and they'll miss it the first time. The second time they'll hit it, but they don't quite lock their head off, and the cow's like screaming or something. I'm sorry for the visceral imagery, but you get it. The second thing is that the animals themselves are really frightened. And we're talking about often like really strong animals, like a cow that'll kind of kick back at you. And this is probably really sexist because women don't have the strength as much to slaughter that cow, and then they might get really hurt if the cow kicks back at them. The third thing to say is that these people are super nervous because they're like, oh, I'm about to kill a human being. They might shake, they might miss, they might not hit hard enough, all that kind of stuff. And the caveat I'll make is like maybe they'll try to like model out of this by being like, oh, we'll find a really like humane and nice way of killing them, but then that obviously just undermines the efficacy of their benefit, so pay no attention to that. The second thing I'll note is that it's obviously harmful to a lot of people. Now, before they say, oh, this is attention because like if people are traumatized, then this must be effective or something, there's a few simple calculuses, right? And I'll describe this in an analogy. So a few months ago, my girlfriend asked me to kill a crab that she was gonna kill. The crab ran around, I got attached to it, I didn't want to kill it, right? So I'm a bit squeamish. However, if God came down and was like, if you don't kill the crab, you'll never eat crab for the rest of your life. I'd fucking take a shotgun and just blow its face off, you know? Like realistically, right? Even if people get slightly traumatized by this, even if this is unpleasant, it is less than the trauma of not eating meat for the rest of your life. The other thing to say is, even if for most people they don't get PTSD, there's a small set of people that'll be crazy traumatized by this and never get to sleep for the rest of their lives. And these are also the people who are most likely to try vegetarianism eventually under our side anyway, which means this kind of slaughter is absolutely unnecessary and inhumane. For these reasons, very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the first negative and I welcome the second affirmative. Here, here.
Sometimes I make funnies and crap, but they don't. Instead, should I borrow it? Okay. Use two, maybe if we're lucky, three parts of this speech. Firstly, I'm going to do the fiat clash thing and explain why I think it's fine for us to ban meat up until the age of 18. Secondly, I'm going to ask the question of how many people will eat meat in either world. And thirdly, I'm going to ask some ethical questions and maybe talk about some philosophy. So firstly, on the fiat clash. This team says we're not allowed to ban meat from 18. I don't know why they said so. Their reason is because, firstly, it would be very unpopular to ban meat up until the age of 18. I would say that kind of nullifies the whole debate because this whole policy seems at least a little bit unpopular to the extent this isn't a thing we're currently doing that suggests people have a real preference not to do it. So obviously it's all a bit unpopular. However, adding a bit more unpopularness is unclear. It depends whether it's specified in the motion that it functions that way or it doesn't function that way, whether this is a level of unpopularness that we're allowed to add into the motion. The second reason they give is that we wouldn't be able to enforce it on under 18s. I just don't think this is a very real claim. Firstly, maybe we could imperfectly enforce it, but there are lots of ways we can stop under 18-year-olds from doing things. Things like we can stop them from doing it outside, which will at least be a pretty significant impairment on being able to eat meat at restaurants and things. We also think that parents are pretty averse to letting their kids do things that are seen as illegal. See, for example, alcohol. Most people don't provide their children when they're like 13 years old with alcohol. Same would probably be true of me. Maybe they sneak you some beef when you're 16, but that's significantly better than having it from the age that you're like 5. But also eating probably causes a pretty significant cultural shift. So neither of this team's reasons why we aren't allowed to do this, I think, really stand up to scrutiny. The bottom line is, this motion can kind of be read in either way. It says you have to earn the right to eat, which implies, of course, that you didn't have that right before, and now you're gaining access to it. It isn't specified in the motion whether you lost that right at 18 or you never had that right. It is completely ambiguous, but one must be the case. And it is unclear to me why this team gets to determine which of those two things is true and we don't. Per the rules of debating, we are the affirmative team. We have definitional fiat over this motion. Those are both reasonable and plausible readings of the motion. You could earn the right by never having had it in the same way that you earn the right to drink alcohol when you turn 18 and you never had it before then. This is a reasonable reading of the motion. It's the way we choose to implement, and we have that God-ordained right to do so as the affirmative team, and I think it's reasonable for you to accept that. That doesn't really harm our case if we can't prove that, because obviously there are several reasons we explain why an 18-year-old, even if they had been eating meat all their life, now confronted with being forced to slaughter a cow, would probably find that a morally difficult decision. But it is obviously a huge benefit for us if you believe what I think is a true reading of the motion, which is, up until the age of 18, you've never consumed meat. You are normalized to the idea of being vegetarian. It doesn't seem like a large imposition on your life to not be able to eat meat anymore, which means your aversion to killing the animal doesn't have to be as significant as it would otherwise be. Very plausible reading of the motion, a fair one for us to choose when we have the right to choose, and I think one which gets us a huge benefit. At that point, I think you should discredit a lot of the analysis that this team provides, which is fairly contingent on that not being the case. Things like people having cultural norms around eating meat, things like it being socially acceptable, things like people really liking meat. All of those things aren't true if you win that very simple and clear fiat clash with force decide affirmative. Next question in the debate then. How many people will eat meat? The first claim that this team makes is that people really like meat and have a lot of cultural norms around eating meat. I'm going to address this as if we hadn't won the fiat clash, even though I think we did. Firstly, I think this isn't true for quite a lot of people. So that is to say, there are some cultures where eating meat is quite important, but like, I don't know, eating meat's not very culturally important to me. I'm sure it's not true of also a lot of other people. So even if there are some cultures in the world where people really care about eating meat, maybe it's part of their spiritual identity, we actually think it's fine that those people continue on our side to eat meat. It's spiritually important to them, they gain other moral benefits from it. Maybe that's okay. But a lot of people who are, like, I think probably the average person, doesn't find meat that morally significant a part of their life, who is doing a moral crime for no good justification, those people stop eating meat. I think that is a pretty significant benefit. But also, even in terms of putting aside the cultural aspect of this, I don't think the claim this team makes about how you're often exposed to killing meat is really true. Like, besides watching videos of it, most people who are raised in cities are never exposed to the slaughtering of an animal. Most people even actively avoid those videos of it. And the fact that now everyone does it at the age of 18 doesn't mean that everyone is constantly exposed to it, because it's not as if everyone goes and gathers round whilst the 18-year-olds slaughter the animals. This is something you do at one point in your life, and therefore, up until that point, you've never really had exposure to it. Maybe you've heard of other people who've done it, but you've probably heard of other people who chose not to do it, and it's not really clear why your exposure to it is so overwhelmingly strong. This argument is fairly circular. They like assume that everyone will kill the animal, and therefore it will be normalized to kill the animal, but that relies, of course, on first proving that people would just start killing animals immediately off the bat. Hence, it becomes the cultural norm to kill the animal when you turn 18. Second response to this, though, is I think that if people are fine to do this, this is the same response, I already said it in the first one, but if it turns out that people are fine to do it, killing this animal, they haven't really proven a harm here, besides when they later try and do it. But I think before I get to that, it's important to recognize that even if this is true, I think we've still done a moral benefit, which is to say, people are now aligning their moral codes and their moral preferences with the way they actually act. They are forced to confront whether their moral intuitions align with the way they would actually behave in the situation which they are purporting to put themselves in when they choose to eat an animal. And if that just inspires good moral reflections on people where they realize different things are true than they thought they would, I think that is still a benefit. Their next claim then is people will all of a sudden decide they want to eat a lot of meat. This is not really very intuitive to me, and I also think it's proven very assertive, and there are a number of ways why I think we should doubt it. The first is to observe that this team relies on people being capable of a very large amount of cognitive dissonance very persistently for a very long time, which is to retroactively change your moral intuitions based on what makes you most comfortable, which is a thing people can sometimes do, but people obviously still find that a very difficult thing. And I think particularly when you have such an important seminal experience like killing an animal, that level of cognitive dissonance might be pretty difficult. But secondly, if this team's claim is people feel quite guilty about killing the animal, therefore they become miraculously capable of this cognitive dissonance to change their moral intuition, I don't understand why that is people's path of least resistance. Like, if that's certainly a difficult thing to do, surely the easier thing to do is just to not kill the animal in the first place, so you never have to engage in this sort of moral hurdle jumping that this team claims people would choose to opt into. But thirdly, I just think this is not very responsive to our analysis, which is, firstly, just how difficult it would be to slaughter an animal, and this team doesn't really weigh that as highly as I think you should. Think about actually slaughtering a cow. Like, that is an animal which you can see breathing, you can see having its heartbeat, you can watch its eyes die, you have to watch blood pour from it, you have to watch the knife that you've just put into its throat drip with blood, knowing that you slaughtered it and knowing that you killed it. You think about all the different cultural representations we've seen of cute animals in farms and how venerated they are and how beautiful they are and how cute they are, and you know that you slaughtered it and you know that you killed it. That is disgusting. People probably feel guilty and horrible about it. Most people's choice, I think, would be to never do that in the first place, and would certainly not go through the level of difficulty that it would provide. But that is especially true if people are not used to eating meat in the way they claim. The easiest way to observe this is to ask yourself, would more people be vegetarian in a world where no one had ever seen an animal die? Where no image of what animal slaughter looks like occurred, would more people be vegetarian? The answer is, of course, no, they wouldn't, because the image of animals dying alone is enough to tip many people into becoming vegetarian, which I think means that for a significantly greater number of people, the act of physically slaughtering an animal yourself is an even greater tip towards that direction. Maybe people are culturally venerated into performing the act of killing an animal because everyone else does it, but after having done it, I think a lot of people would question themselves every time afterwards when they choose to eat meat. That should explain to you that far less people eat meat, and we live in a far, far better world, and a series of benefits flow on from that. We prevent the genocide of animals that occurs every single day, the 60 billion chickens that die each year. We protect the environment in a meaningful way to reduce emissions. We prevent things like pandemics, and we prevent things like heart attacks in people who eat in unhealthy ways. This is a clear affirmative.
I'd like to thank the
I watched a pig get slaughtered on my fourth birthday when I was in rural China. Yes, it screamed. Yes, it was kind of freaky. But has that changed my capacity or desire to eat meat? And no, it hasn't. And the reality is, this is the most inner West sharehouse case I've seen in my fucking life. Because the vast majority of people in the world probably live in a rural area, probably have parents who work somewhat adjacent to a meat industry. Often people just go out and go fishing because it's a hobby and have seen fish get killed. Like, you grossly underestimate people's exposure to the death of animals even at a young age. And that is something which does desensitize people, and it's something which means they're very willing to opt into this policy. So there's really only one issue in this debate, right? It's what happens to meat consumption. And let's talk about how their modelling doesn't actually stop the vast majority of harms which can occur. We say, they first go, well, we have an under 18 ban. We say that this is true, also we can also have that under outside of all the same stuff. But also, this is the world's least enforceable ban in the world, right? And I actually disagree with Charlie. I think parents do actually quite frequently sneak a cheeky vodka for the kid when they're having a good time, but it is actually more likely when it's meat for a few reasons. The first of which is that there is no immediate negative health impact of consuming meat compared to having alcohol, which deters your development of grey matter and is kind of unhealthy, makes you drunk, it makes you unpleasant to be around. But secondly, often it's very simple. It's like, oh, we don't want any leftovers here. Can you have the leftover beef casserole? And that's something which the kid just consumes as well. The third thing is that there are health benefits, that protein is a health benefit, and you bet when this policy comes in, every single meat lobbyist is going to be like, this is really going to help your kid, and it's really good for their health as well. But also, fourth thing, like, it's totally unprovable, which is to say, like, what happens in the domestic home, no one can really enforce it, no one actually knows. But also, secondly, even to the extent that this is something which is enforceable, right, I think this narrative gets kind of flipped in a very perverse way, which is saying, yes, maybe you haven't consumed any meat, but the day you kill an animal and earn the right to consume meat, that becomes a rite of passage in a lot of countries in the world and lots of areas in the world. And which is to say, you know, this is something which happens quite for sets of reasons. Firstly, I think this is something the meat industry will market quite heavily, that when you kill an animal and you become a man, that is something which is you're growing up towards, is something which happens quite frequently. Even dads tell the girls to be tough, men want to appear strong, that is something which probably exists. But the second thing here is that people like these cultural narratives are coming to age. You become an adult and you become a bearer of more full rights when you were a child. This becomes one of the things, and it becomes something which is ritualized and something which people are encouraged towards. Which definitely also suggests that even if it's something which is squeamish, there are many sources in the world telling this child, this is going to be okay. I've done it, it wasn't that hard. This is something which you can also do as well. You can practice here. This is the technique you use to kill the animal. It will be very quick and it'll be over and done with. And all these things prep the person towards not being particularly uncomfortable or squeamish in a way which forces them to opt out of meat eating as well. The second thing that I say here is that, well, I think I have a debate losing model here as well, which is that you have to earn the right to eat each animal you kill, which is to say you have to kill a fish to eat a fish, kill a chicken to eat a chicken. And it's this debate losing for a few reasons. Because firstly, some animals are necessarily easier to kill than others, which is to say a fish is relatively easy to kill because it's relatively small, it's relatively instant, there's not many things that can go wrong, it doesn't scream. It means it's not as visceral as compared to killing something like a cow. Alternatively, even things like chickens, far smaller, and relatively straightforward as well. It doesn't take much force to cut through a chicken's head, and yes, maybe it runs around a bit and it's a bit headless, but overall it is less traumatizing than all the ways in which Charlie describes when you have to kill a cow, and it's far more personal. But the problem here is that once you make your first 1 or 2 kills, it necessarily desensitizes you from any sorts of killing, because it is unclear to me what the moral worth of a cow is meaningfully higher than the moral worth of chicken. Which is why when you kill the chicken, you've already sunk the moral cost of I'm now going to consume animals, even if society narratives tell me that this is something which is bad. I've done it already. It's easier for me to kill the pig, it's easier for me to kill the sheep, it's easier for me to kill the cow, and that's something which people opt into as well. But the second observation I make is even thinking at the best, maybe you don't kill a cow and the demand for cows increase. I think killing a chicken is actually and eating fish is actually far worse than any of these big animals, because the reason for this is, you know, when you kill a cow, that cow can feed a village. It's a big animal. When you kill a chicken, it feeds a mildly hungry David. And the problem here is that to be full, it therefore means you need to kill far more chickens in order to actually sustain people's appetites. So if you're looking at the individual moral worth of each animal, having more people eat chicken and having more people eat fish grossly increases the amount of lives that are being lost. So that was the principal metric they wanted to debate on. They clearly lose this debate because it means more people just only eat chicken, but you need to eat more chicken to be full, and that is the reason as to why more animals end up being killed on their side, and there's a harm. But also, secondly, just gonna lay out some like harms of the chicken industry and why it's particularly bad as well, right? Like firstly, chicken feed is also is like grown from grain, so it's the same energy inefficient mechanisms they talk about, which means you're still wasting lots of land growing chicken feed and transferring the chickens who then eat it. But also secondly, I think the increase in demand is also far more likely to encourage sort of negative practices, things like battery farming, which is particularly awful for chickens who aren't able to socialize, but chickens eat so much they can't actually participate in natural kind of behaviors like rolling around in dirt or being to interact with others as well, or just simply being able to, you know, have their hierarchies where they can interact with other chickens. I think that's particularly pernicious. I think the third thing to note here is that the chickens are uniquely bad because you can't eat male chickens because the meat is quite tough, so they just instantly die. Which is why for all their demands where you eat like all your female chickens in the world, all the male chickens get fed through a powdered, you know, like a powdered smokehouse, they get, you know, and that I think is particularly harmful, which definitely means once again they increase their lives lost markedly increased, which is to say, they don't shift the consumption habits away from meat, they shift it to worse industries, which result in worse outcomes where more lives are lost, and that is why I think even in that sort of model, it is particularly harmful. So then, let's deal more specifically some of the responses coming out of Charlie's speech about squeamish. Because let's be clear, Oscar's speech was 3 minutes of setup, 1 mechanism of squeamishness, and then 5 minutes of impacting. Like that is the whole case, the whole thing which their whole the debate stands on. And there's a few simple responses here, right? The first thing to note here is to say, I think that when you abandon having something until you turn 18, it actually makes you want to do it more. Like for example, when you're banned from having alcohol as a kid, you turn 18, you're really looking forward to that one vodka cruiser, right? Which is why I think it's something people often look forward towards, and even if they don't have it in their diet, it sometimes becomes very heavy in their diet, which is to say, you know, the people who get the most drunk are often university students who just get out of high school and finally have some alcohol. And I think that sort of logic similarly applies to me as well, because that's something that they can enjoy. But secondly, I think they also underestimate the propensity of kids' capacity to experience death of animals as well. And maybe like a bug is different from a chicken, but kids frequently do kill bugs. They kill like snails. They inflict pain on small animals where maybe the pain is less discernible, which is to say, yes, maybe a fish or a chicken is a bit larger and is a bit different, but people do actually do these things, which mean that killing something or killing something which is different from human beings is something which is within their consciousness and within something which they are necessarily capable of, and it's not that bad. I think the third thing to note here is that when it comes to the notion of like difficulty and actually seeing visible images, like because you don't ban the consumption of meat as a whole, you assume your annoying PETA advocates still exist protesting with images of cows getting slaughtered in awful ways, and these videos are still around in the public space, which therefore means I think when kids walk around, they still see these images. And the problem with images is that the images simply are not that bad. It doesn't actually reflect all the cruelties of the industry. It reflects often one of instances where it might look at this cow, it's a bit sad when they're getting killed, and that is something which is at worst similar to the child's experience. They turn 18 and now are going to kill that animal as well, which is why they're actually more normalized, because this isn't a wholesale ban. That therefore means that I think they have more exposure to death, they have more exposure. You see that it's not actually that easy and that bad, and as a result, I think it desensitizes them as well. Note here, that is extended mechanization. The responses which we hear from Charlie do not deal with the whole suite of things which David tells you about why people are going to be, victimized for being a coward and not killing people, why for cultural reasons people often do this, why people acquire taste of meat, and also the fact that the meat industry is likely to lobby people to be able to access this right as well. I think this is an awful idea, and it is shocking.
Welcome, third affirmative. Here.
Western meat eaters that live in cities are doing an act of moral evil that is insanely indefensible. I think David's right that many people are kind of justifiably willing to kill the animals that they personally have raised, and that they form a moral schema of reciprocity around. Like, people conceive of the chickens that they've raised as chickens that they've put a lot of time and energy into, as chickens that they've given things to and that they take food from, that is important for their society, that is often culturally important. But helpfully, Affirmative makes two moral claims in this debate, the latter of which is that people who are disconnected from meat production are doing a specific act of moral cowardice. To live a princely, over-nutritioned existence, disconnected from other beings, and outsource every act of violence, cruelty, and inconvenience to someone else, likely a low-paid worker who's at risk of contracting an animal-borne disease. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, I will deal with the morality, and then secondly, I will ask, very importantly, I think, does this make meat eating go up or down? On morality, I'm going to focus on the non-contingent part of this principle. This principled argument does not rely on people eating less meat on our side of the house, because the claim that we make is it's immoral to eat something you would not kill. And so if people would kill it, then we're saying like that's a less immoral thing than someone outsourcing the killing. The intuition here, and I think this is something even a lot of vegetarians kind of intuitively believe in the way that people like propose meat bans and stuff, is that it's kind of more moral to eat meat if you are, for instance, an indigenous person who's hunted that meat yourself. That's why a lot of even vegetarians and vegans are like, oh, we should probably let Inuit people eat seals or whatever. And that is because that act of killing, well, maybe I would make the claim still a little bit regrettable, often involves a greater degree of respect for the animal, of conceiving of the animal as a worthy opponent in some way, or of having connection to it and valuing the food source that it is providing to you. It is often more humane because of that practice, and it is often less wasteful because you appreciate the time, energy, and suffering that went into that kill. The things you are doing if you are not willing to kill the animal yourself, that is additionally immoral, in addition to whatever suffering you've caused, is first of all, you're devaluing the life of an animal. You're desubjectifying it in a really important way. You're declining to understand it as a life and as a being at all. You say, that's a bit too icky and morally inconvenient for me, so I will entirely abstract it away. And I think that is an act of indefensible cruelty. But you are also being cruel to yourself. You are not giving yourself the opportunity to act morally. You're not giving yourself the information you need to make that choice as a moral agent. You're instead being a coward. You're saying, I am willing to cause suffering, but I'm not willing to look it in the eye or to understand it or to view the being that I'm willing to take the life of. I think that even if all we're doing in this debate is just supplying people with the ability to act morally according to their own moral schemas, we've won the debate. Let's now talk about whether or not this makes meat eating go up or down. Helpfully, I think Negative has broadly conceded that meat eating is kind of bad and we want less of it, which means I'm just going to focus on the mechanisms here. Negative's claims broadly here are that people feel extra vociferous about their right to eat meat at the point where they've killed an animal, and that means they eat more meat. I think there are a series of problems with this argument. Firstly, I just want to note how uncomparative they are throughout their case. Like, so much of their case is like, well, you know, one thing about when you, like, they're just residing in mitigation city. They're like, one thing about, you know, banning children from drinking alcohol is sometimes they still drink alcohol. Like, I suspect if you took away that ban, children would drink more alcohol, right? Like, I just think that this argument is purely mitigation. People currently have the right to eat meat, and by their analysis, people currently feel quite strongly about the right to eat meat. People currently justify meat eating to themselves by, you know, not depersonalizing, but desubjectifying animals or whatever, as is conceded by David at some length. People currently have eating meat as an act of masculine rite of passage, see barbecuing as like a man meme. Like, you know, clearly the ways that they describe meat eating as central to culture is fatal to them proving a delta in this debate, because it explains that people are already kind of meat maxing in the status quo. Like, I don't know what is the limit on people's willingness to eat meat in the status quo. It sounds like people really like it, they do a lot of it, and I don't know what exactly is constraining them. I don't think it's that they feel bad, and so I don't really understand what the mech here is. Like, people were feeling more vociferous for some reason, but like they're already eating a shit ton of meat. I don't really get it. Charlie asks a really important question in their speech that does not receive a response, which is, do you believe there would be more vegetarians in a world if people never saw an animal die? Which is what the mechanisms provided you, like, if taken to their extreme by negative, should make you believe. Like, people, if they had no conception of how animals died, they didn't need to justify it to themselves, would be vegetarian at a high rate. I think they quite clearly would not. A couple of extra things to say though here. I want to just quickly rebut the thing about people eating more chicken. I think that we can flip this quite simply by saying that of all the meat sources, we would prefer people to eat chicken because it is, like, by a country mile the best for the environment. Like, if people switched from cow to chicken en masse, you would do a good thing for the climate, like, pretty immediately. So that's fine. I don't think it's that important. But I think additionally, in terms of, like, people kill a chicken and then they feel like it's easier for them to kill their next animal, like a weird little freak animal serial killer. I think that this is unimportant as well. Lots of people very intuitively feel like there are differences between different animals, which is why, for instance, people might be okay killing a chicken, but would not kill their dog. I think they need to prove this argument more. I do not think you just, like, accumulate notches in your fucking knife and get used to killing animals. What you should ask yourself then is that, does the increase in moral license that they describe outweigh the set of people whose minds are changed that we describe? And as I've explained, I think this difference in moral license is quite small, because the moral license is already very large. But we explain a series of ways in which people are likely to have their minds change about eating meat. And I want to know, even if this is just soy people living in the inner west, that's good. Like, I reckon it's actually pretty awesome for side affirmative. If, like, people who really need to eat chicken because they live in a rural village keep eating chicken, sure, they can do that. As I said, they're probably doing a less immoral thing. And, like, the soy individuals who I inhabit a share house with become vegetarian. It'd be great for me, there'd be less fucking steak in the fridge. So, that is to say, I just think, like, again, they're residing in mitigation city, but I think, like, the set of people who do take the steak out of their fridge is quite large. Like, they describe the trauma and violence of killing a cow. It sounds really hard, you probably would not do it in many instances. And maybe people call you a pussy, but, like, you're not killing a bunch of cows, so that's a benefit for side affirmative. Secondly, there's a bunch of innate factors, I think, that just make this an act which feels quite difficult for a lot of people. Like, it's not true that caring about animals is culturally specific only to the inner west. Sorry, there are, like, millions of Indian vegetarians who afford a great deal of significance to animals' lives. And I think for a lot of people, looking into an animal's eye before you kill it, and cows are pretty cute, to be fair, makes it difficult to continue to eat meat. And I think, additionally, this just is morally salient every time you eat meat. Like, when you go to cut up a chicken, you imagine the chicken you killed, and maybe it doesn't stop you eating meat straight away. Maybe it is still culturally valuable and people try to do it and want to do it, but I think it does make it harder, and I think it is something that accelerates the switch to vegetarianism that they describe, because they're like, well, you know, some people would become vegetarian anyway, and maybe this just speeds it up. Awesome, like, they kill, like, way less chickens, you know, in that period where they become vegetarian quicker. That's, again, a win for us. Finally, I just want to note that it is not clear to me that ritualized killing, or killing as a rite of passage, makes people more brutal. I think, in fact, in a lot of cultures where you have this kind of thing where people have to kill an animal to show their worth, you view animals as more worthy and you care about them more because they are part of a very significant part of your life. And the way people justify it is by hyping up the importance of the animal rather than minimizing it, which means, I think, actually it's more likely that people care about the conditions that those animals are kept in, and maybe it is more likely they view it, for instance, as a celebration food rather than something you have to eat every day. Even if people still eat meat, they understand animals as real beings that they have to consider as moral agents. Even if they're moral agents, they still eat. I think that is a benefit for side affirmative. Finally and quickly on trauma. I think this is relatively unimportant in the debate for two reasons. First of all, how do you reckon it feels for the chicken? And secondly, and more importantly, I think this is just massively self-mitigated by all of Side Negative's analysis about how, people justify it to themselves, it's very culturally normal, lots of people kill chickens every day. Clearly isn't that traumatic for thousands of rural farmers, so I don't think that it's that important. But if it is traumatic to you, it probably should be. You should feel distressed about the pain and suffering of an animal. I think that's totally fine. It leads to an important moral transformation that we describe at length to no response. Very proud of you.
I'm going to start by winning the debate super clearly. So, the set of animals that are most easy to kill are the small ones, yeah? So, they're easier, they're less likely, so you're more likely to do it in one, you're less likely to have difficulty killing it. Therefore, the set of animals that people will choose to get the pass for are disproportionately likely to be the smaller animals. Now, the problem with the smaller animals is that per life taken, there's less kilograms of meat. So if you constrict yourself only to small animals, then assuming this amount of meat stays at least relatively the same, or even if it did as much as halved on their side, we'd need to kill way more animals to get the same kilograms. So if now people are just killing chickens, that means in your lifetime, assuming you would have eaten, maybe 50 cows if you were a very big meat eater, instead you kill 10,000 chickens, right? And that is just instantly debate winning on the number of animals killed pretty clearly, right? And I'll note, Ellie then says, oh, it's fine because actually they're environmentally better. So the three metrics that they give for why killing animals are bad are: one, it harms the environment; second, it's bad for human health; third, it's a fucking genocide and we're murdering things with human value. Obviously, the "it's a fucking genocide" is the vast majority of the moral harm that comes from animals. So if it's environmentally better, but we have to kill way more animals, then we very clearly win the debate, because the "it's genocide" is a much more important metric than the health, and particularly than the environment. And also, I'm going to flip the environment here. First, the environment as a metric is something that we can regulate. When David said this would be unpopular, therefore we can regulate it to make it easier. Secondly, smaller animals are often worse for the environment. First, because a smaller portion of their body mass is made up by meat, so it means that you're having to kill more. And secondly, because you have more space between the animals, right? Because the amount of space needed between an animal on a farm isn't contingent on the size of the animal, right? Like a smaller animal isn't more happy to have it closer, so it becomes way more space inefficient. But look, I really actually don't give a shit. It's a genocide is the most important way that this is bad. They genocide way more animals by their own model. We win the debate. Now let's get to the number of people who eat meat. So the first thing they say is, well, our argument is just mitigation. Here's how this debate has happened. Two metrics. One, how many people are locked out. Two, how does that affect the set of people who will eat meat when they opt in, right? They get one, we get the other, and then we cross-mitigate each other. So we provide mitigation to theirs, they provide mitigation to ours. The difference is when they provide mitigation to ours, we rebut the mitigation. When we provide mitigation to theirs, they say, this is just mitigation. So at the end of the debate, their mitigation doesn't stand because we rebutted it. Our mitigation does stand, and that means that our size is comparatively bigger, right? It just being mitigation doesn't rebut it. What are the claims that they make? The first thing that they say is, well, norms are circular, and all of our arguments about how it would start out
how it will become a norm rely on it starting out being the majority. So they agree. If initially most people eat this, then more people will continue to eat it. If initially most people don't eat meat, then most people won't, right? So if it starts at a majority, it'll trend to 100%. If it starts at a minority, it'll trend to 0%, right? Because they agree that it's a self-perpetuating cycle on whether or not it starts at the majority. So does it start at the majority or does it start at the minority? Because that is what forms what the norm is. 3 reasons why it's going to start with the vast majority of people. First, the people who are opting in have, at the very beginning, with day 0 of this policy, are 50-year-olds who have eaten meat their whole life. They probably opt in. Secondly, people will be backlashing against it and be very unhappy, so they're unlikely to reward the government and opt out of eating meat, which is the thing that they want when the policy is first passed. And thirdly, day 0, the meat eating industry would have a huge push to convince people to do it, and they have way more capital than the vegans or whatever. So it's likely that from day 0, the majority of people do it, which proves the prerequisite premise that they wanted us to prove in order for the normalization. The next thing that they say as well, you can't retroactively maintain that level of cognitive dissonance. First, people definitely can maintain cognitive dissonance over long periods of time. Lots of people are against child slavery, but still buy clothes that use it, and use shitty cop-outs like, well, I can't opt out of society if I'm a part of it, like that meme with the dude with the sticks. But obviously you could, right? There are fashion brands that use less child slavery. People find weird cop-outs, people do maintain cognitive dissonance. But secondly, there's actually more cognitive dissonance on their side, because what I would say is on their side it needs to be, I am a good person, but I murdered an animal. So that is where the cognitive dissonance comes from. And what that means is that they're likely to resolve that cognitive dissonance in favor of, I murdered an animal not being bad, such to reconcile it. So the degree of cognitive dissonance on our side is actually far, far less. They then say this doesn't normalize it because children wouldn't have done it. The first thing I note is they obviously try and model in a lot of extra stuff. That's fine, but everything that isn't the motion is 100% co-optable on our side, i.e. investment in legumes, banning under 18. So they can't generate the benefit from that. But I note here, just because you don't do it under 18 doesn't mean it's not normalized for you. For instance, most under 18-year-olds are not drinking alcohol or having sex at particularly high rates, but they still see it as a normal, shut the fuck up. They still see it as a part of what it looks like to be a normal adult, right? It can still be a normalized part of adulthood that you understand, even if you're not taking part of it as a child. So that doesn't defeat our normalization mechanism. Additionally, even if it's not, they say that defeating normalization defeats a lot more of our own. Charlie is well, that takes out material on culture, that takes out material on liking meat, that takes out material on social pressure. No, it doesn't. Culture can still value eating meat, even if children are locked out of it and then it's the norm. That doesn't take that out. The next thing that they say as well, it's actually already maximized everyone's ability to eat meat. Once you do it, you have the maximized incentive to stuff your face with as much as possible. So this argument doesn't make sense. We point out a bunch of reasons why probably some people aren't currently eating as much meat as the maximum possible capacity. 1, health. 2nd, environment. 3rd, they care about animals. Oh, I can't remember where I heard all that all now. So it's an excellent first affirmative speech. 4th, there's a degree of stigma against that. And 5th, often you're allowed around vegetarians. Often you want a hot vegetarian girl to go out with you, so you're going to pretend you're not going to eat meat. There's a whole bunch of reasons why you might not eat as much meat. The next thing they say as well, you're probably actually happier to kill the animal on a farm than you would be on in this system. But no, when you're on a farm, you've developed a connection with that animal. Clearly your empathy outweighs any argument that well, you feel like it's okay to kill it because you've given something, you fed it, and now murder is okay. Clearly empathy is the dominant emotion in that relationship. Finally, they say more people are going to see an animal dying. There's more, first of all, most people have probably seen it, they've seen a PETA ad. But secondly, we point out that there's an optimal level of guilt, because you push people's guilt to a particular point, and that's beneficial in getting them to stop doing something. But if you push it too far, it's too far for them to reconcile at all. So they negatively polarize into self-justification. So we flip that and point out why a higher level of guilt is actually negative for people opting out. Would people opt into this? We give a bunch of reasons why they're likely to. They then say, well, you'd only opt into a few kinds of animals, even if you would opt in, so it still reduce your meat consumption on net. First, I note, if you decrease options for my meat types, it's not clear I eat less meat, I'd probably just eat more of my existing, I'd probably just eat more beef, pork, and chicken, even if I can't eat the smaller meats. Secondly, very few meat types dominate the vast majority of consumption. And third of all, it's way easier the second time, right? So you probably can continue to. But fourth, as I point out, if it's only the smaller animals, that is an enormous harm for their side. Final thing that I want to explain is that we explained that this would be awful for the animal. And if you're at all unsure about the level of meat consumption, I think this is the tiebreaker that wins it for us. Because we explained that it would be deeply scary for the animal in that moment. And they say, yeah, how does it feel for the animal? Yeah, awful. their response is instead of to say, well, we would make this not very bad, right? We would do things that make it not particularly cruel for the animal. But when they talk about things like halal butchery, that is something that requires an incredibly high level of skill, so you can't have a lay individual do it. So that means people probably hesitate. The animal watches as you stand over them with an axe. It means you're doing it in an unskilled way without precision. And because people have an irrational correlation that more force equals bigger injury, they're probably likely to not give it as much force as they need to, which means that they're more likely to end up in a situation where, because they're timorous, they don't finish it in one shot, which means you need to go back for seconds, which is incredibly cruel.
There's a simple natural experiment that disproves the whole case, which is that historically and today, millions of people who lived in agricultural settings around the world already did what they did, right? Like, people grew up having to kill chickens. Often people in hunting society saw it as a rite of passage, your first kill, all the rhetoric that Ellie was talking about the deep ethereal connection you have to the animal that you killed and now you have to eat them. And all of these people were not traumatized. It's a bit unpleasant. They moved on from it pretty quickly. Yes, they often valued the meat more, as Ellie said, but they valued it more as meat, not necessarily as anything you want to keep and care for. And we'll note that, just statistically, people from rural and regional areas are often politically the most against vegetarianism. Contrast this to the empirical reality Charlie talks about, which is things like veganism and vegetarianism were actually born in cities where people had a removal from that form of desensitization. So empirically what we can see is that the action that they're talking about drives people towards desensitization and not towards moral caring and moral concern. And that is the key crucial trade-off in this debate that we win on. But more analytically, what we explain is a number of mechanisms they never respond to. Moral license, desensitization, sunk cost fallacy, no moral reservation. They prove some of this themselves when they say, well, we need to align you with your actions and prove that you have balls. And that's the kind of rhetoric that leads to my mechanism that I give at first about how you're seen as cowardly if you don't do this. Or also, Toomey explains that they now can no longer respond to, that you kill more lives on net when you're actually just killing lots of small animals in order to not be squeamish. And importantly, we weigh this against them because the kinds of people who stay and continue to eat that meat are likely to eat a lot more meat, right? We see this in stats where, for example, fatsos in developed countries obviously eat a lot more meat than people in developing countries who really like meat, eat a lot more meat than people who are just about it, right? So the change that happens on our side of encouraging those people to eat more meat is a lot more significant than the change they get of, desensitizing some squeamish people out, which I know in my first speech, those squeamish people might have been receptive to campaigns in the status quo to reduce their meat reduction, try vegetarianism, or try, other forms of anti-cruelty or lab-grown meat investment. So given that what we prove is that not only is the direction of this debate towards our side and that people are more towards opting in, take all the day zero analysis Toomey gives about how the norms will influence people towards opting in, and the people that opt in will eat a lot more meat and cause a lot more moral harm, and the people that they change is very, very small. Now let's talk about the principle. There's a big tension in the principle because at Oscar, they're like, well, killing animals and hurting animals is totally indefensible. But then at Charlie and Ellie, they're like, it's totally okay to kill animals as long as you have the balls to do it yourself and prove that you're consistent. And not only is this just incoherent because it's two different lines of argumentation, but also I explained at first to no response that this is an utterly disturbing principle. The idea that it is okay for you to do something if you're able to do it yourself, right? It's okay if you're racist, if you're willing to be racist to people in their face. It's okay to massacre a certain group of people if you're willing to play a hand in it. I just don't think that is something we should be morally celebrating. And I would say the value of the life of that animal is probably more valuable and more like important than the value of you just being morally consistent. Like, I don't care if I have to be a hypocrite if someone doesn't have to die, if an animal doesn't have to die. And that's why that principle never ever was going to be persuasive to an ordinary individual person. Animals also, we explain, suffer from all of these botched killings. Like they don't really respond to this except trying to say they are regulated. But that doesn't defeat the structural reasons we explain, which is that people are inherently unskilled in killing. Like, unless you're gonna like train them in killing animals, which is like a whole nother bag of worms for them. Like, people are likely to screw this up, animals are likely to be scared and all that kind of stuff. This causes a lot more cruelty, and it causes a lot more psychic harm to a small set of people that are likely to be traumatized from this. All of these harms add up to almost like no benefit, which means that the kind of killing of these animals is totally unnecessary. For these reasons, very proud to this.
I can't believe that this negative team accuses us of being woke in a West share house of veggie heads, when they chose, among the panoply of ways they could have chosen to negate this motion, the most cowardly. The reason I spent so much time in my first affirmative impacting the world of less meat eating is because I expected this team of post-woke, post-left, senile old heads, as they like to self-style, to robustly defend meat eating. Instead, they chose the most mealy-mouthed strategy they could have possibly conceived. Meat eating is bad, they concede to us from first negative. Then they say, well, most people would pursue the right to eat meat if they were forced to own it. And this is how they want to win the debate. Those people would reactively eat more meat because they hate to have obtained a right and not use it robustly. Goodness gracious, I've not even gotten to the craziest bit, which is they're also, sometimes and in some speeches, fine with also instituting a ban on under 18s eating meat. So this becomes a debate solely about the question, does an 18-year-old who has never eaten meat, on average, decide to kill a cow on their 18th birthday, and subsequently become a more vociferous meat eater than if they had merely obtained the right as a matter of course? They take the clear blue sky afforded to them in this debate and are genuinely cowards to have pursued such a narrow strategy. And happily, I would say it is self-defeating. Look, I don't hope at our reply to add the insight to suddenly change your mind about the mechanistic question that every other speaker has spent most of their speech on. What I want to just spend a bit of time observing, though, is just how bizarrely unintuitive it is. And I think critically, there's a mech impact problem, where the mechanism used to illustrate the case contravenes the impact that they end up establishing from it. So claim A is, people culturally just pog out over meat, it's machismo, they love that stuff. Meat lobbies have so much economic power, and that's why people would be pushed to kill, because it's such a seminal part of their lives and their cultures. And the impact they extract from that is, those people, because they will now desensitize to themselves to this phenomenon, will now eat more meat than ever before. And that's just weird, because that's pretty self-defeating. If you're like, people value this so much, it's such a significant part of their life, that's why they'll do it. And then you're like, well, they'll do it even more than they already do, which at the absolute best for them really marginalizes the benefit they're getting out of their case. By contrast, I think the quantification of the sets of people who we think just stop eating meat altogether on our side are pretty clear. People who are veggers who are on the edge, people who are physically averse to the idea of killing a living being, which I don't think is a trivial number of people. I think culturally ambivalent people who don't have a particular attachment to meat, but do it just because they can, people like me and Charlie and the negative team, I think also probably stop. And that quantification is clear. At third, they go all in on chicken genocide, because they claim at second, people will choose chickens over cows, which concedes the neck of our case, which is that it's some extent physically aversive to kill things, people would want to avoid it. But they then co-opt our moral argument against us and say, well, there'll be more deaths per chicken per how many people you're feeding. And our rebuttal at third affirmative is this would have exacerbate climate change. At third negative, they concede that. But that's a trick, because climate change, if they are conceding that becoming worse as a phenomenon as a result of more cow farming, just does result in biodiversity losses. It does result in the deaths of so many animals, and probably also humans prospectively. That probably means that we weigh out on the moral thing there. But unfortunately, and matching me at third negative, does the biggest job of ignoring this. We make two moral claims, and I said them in my speech, David. It's regrettable to kill an animal, but obviously we're ambivalent about that to some extent. The most immoral thing is the desubjectification of animals. If it's unclear what changes read the number of animals dying, whether that's more chickens or more cows, know that we are patching one of the grandest injustices of Western moral life, that most people in this room are not fine with killing a cow, and they don't find that regrettable within the context of a debate, but we'll go outside tomorrow and eat a meat lover's pizza at the social. Have some moral fibre and vote for the fucking affirmative team.